I'm going to kick this off by reading a comment from Haruki, who's a longtime viewer. I'll give a link to his YouTube channel below this video. Haruki makes videos in Japanese, but also German, English. I think Spanish is coming up on his channel. So he's a man who studies many different languages. Haruki wrote to me saying, a couple of years ago, I attended a conference in Europe. A conference where scientists and policymakers came together to address climate change and resource use. So this is an ecological conference he attended. Back then I was so naive and optimistic to expect that people there would talk about veganism at some point. As we all know, it will have tremendous benefits for the environment. However, as you can imagine, the topic of diet never came up. In fact, they did not talk about any practical solutions to tackle climate change whatsoever. The only things they discussed were paradigm shift and degrowth. And as you might guess, none of the catering options were vegan. There were some vegetarian options, but it was mostly meat. So I had to speak up about the benefits of changing our diet and the problem of offering non-vegan meals at a conference of this kind that was trying to address climate change. At the end of the conference, one of the organizers came up to me and said that I was being disrespectful. Note that word, disrespectful. As he had tried hard to offer only organic food and meals. I came to the conclusion that there is no hope in them to lead society to adopt climate change mitigation practices. I understand that some scientists and politicians do really practice veganism or seriously address another practical solution, but the majority seem not to be. So there's several different things I want to respond to here in this message from Haruki. First and foremost, I'll just say that issue of disrespect, it's worth taking the time to really try to imagine the other side's perspective there. For you and me, for most people watching this channel, it seems so obvious that veganism is linked to questions of ecology, and that it's absurd and counterproductive for someone to be advocating on these ecological issues while buying and serving meat, or while engaging in the greenwashing of meat, the ecological glorification of certain kinds of fancy meat, such as organic meat. This is counterproductive and immoral, etc., etc. That's obvious from our perspective. But there's another perspective here from whom those ideas are so new, so shocking, so unthinkable, that they think it is disrespectful for Haruki to mention veganism at this conference. This organizer thought it was disrespectful for him to raise it. That's very interesting. Right? Now, I mean, this is an issue for me. It speaks to me in many different ways. Obviously, I'm involved with veganism for a long time, interested and engaged with issues of ecology, but these are not the only political issues in my life that matter to me. I also cared about endangered languages, indigenous peoples, all kinds of issues in history and politics of Southeast Asia, many, many political issues in my life. I think that when people at a conference like this stand up and speak about a really irrelevant issue, people do not treat it as disrespectful, right? Like, let's say Haruki had stood up and said, yeah, well, what about police brutality against African Americans, against black people in the United States? That would be irrelevant. I mean, climate change and police brutality towards black people, it's really irrelevant. And at conferences, people do that kind of thing all the time. I've spoken at conferences, I give my speech and then someone wants to stand up and make a statement about their faith in Jesus Christ. Like, really, when you do conferences, whether it's academic conferences or ecological conferences, all kinds of intellectual forums, people will stand up and mention something that is so irrelevant that it's embarrassing. And you got to deal with it. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have a moderator. They have to moderate the discussion, and that includes telling people, I'm sorry, this is irrelevant, we can't talk about this. I do not think that someone who raised an issue like that about, ethnicity or something like that, something totally irrelevant, I do not think they would have been addressed as being disrespectful, and Haruki was, right? His mentioning of veganism was treated as disrespectful. Why is that? I think this reflects the extent to which veganism is perceived as a threat by these people, and maybe it really is a threat. You know what I mean? This is a threat to, their whole paradigm. I hate the overused word paradigm. It's a threat to the way they see themselves as consumer activists, as consumer advocates, as ecological activists. It's a threat to how they live their lives on a day-to-day basis. It's a threat to their whole message, and it's a threat to their conception of themselves as being part of the solution instead of being part of the problem. Veganism draws a very clear line as to who is part of the problem and who is part of the solution. And all the people at this conference suddenly see themselves as being on the wrong side of the line. Now, I can relate to this partly. There's really one conference in particular I'm thinking of where I was disgusted that the whole conference, everyone was eating meat. And it was basically supposed to be a conference on Buddhist philosophy. So there were, academics there. There were university professors who taught Buddhist philosophy. There were also a huge number of Buddhist monks in their full robes, in uniform. And I was the only person there who even asked for a vegetarian option. Nobody else even asked. And I know because I walked up to the staff and I was speaking to the staff in Laotian. I've probably mentioned this anecdote before somewhere on YouTube, somewhere in the last couple of years. So nobody else asked, nobody else cared. And I could see on their plates, everyone else there was eating the meat. Like it wasn't like they were avoiding it at the buffet or something. And, again, now I did not discuss it with the other people attending the conference. I discussed it with the kitchen staff. And they tried to get me some. But I said to the kitchen staff, this is supposed to be a conference about Buddhist philosophy. You have nothing vegetarian. Everything, this is unforgivable. This is ridiculous. And they agreed. they cooked something new for me. They created a fresh option. Again, this has this sort of terrible sense of an ethical undertow. No matter how polite you are about it, there's an element of accusation. Because we're making a very clear call to say, this is the minimum standard I expect you to live up to. Now, the other question is, why can't people respond to that positively? Why can't someone at a conference like this say, oh, this is a new and alien idea? I haven't really thought about it before. This is the first time I'm encountering this. Why can't they react to that in a more positive or constructive way? There are many bad things I can say about ecology as an intellectual habit of mind or as an academic discipline. In many ways, it's a kind of terribly lazy and fatuous field that has made shockingly little progress of any kind in the last 30 years. I mean, it hasn't even made progress philosophically, in my opinion, and it's been pathetic as a series of political movements, whether you look at the Green Party or other attempts to articulate the mandate of ecology in politics. I think it's really lamentable how terrible things have been in the last 30 years. However, with that being said, the sort of habit of mind you practice in ecology, and I think Haruki himself will have experience of this, are really a whole bunch of tiny little paradigm shifts where you find out about a factor that you just weren't aware of previously. So I'll give you an example. Carpeting and drapes. No, this is not a dirty joke. I mean that literally. I remember with one of my girlfriends, she was complaining about the ecological significance of the difference between fancy plastic bags, when you buy something at a shop and they give you a thicker, more beautiful plastic bag, and thinner, cheaper plastic bags. She thought that this was a big ecological problem, that more and more shops were using this slightly fancier and more reusable style of plastic bag. And so I'm sorry, this is just not true. When you look at the waste stream, so the waste stream is an attempt to mathematically analyze how much garbage ends up in the landfills of the world, how much gets recycled, how much gets put into landfills. When you do waste stream analysis, all plastic bags of this kind, they are just not a considerable source of pollution or waste. Whether you're looking at it in percentages or ranked categories of what's important. And I said, you are going to be shocked to find they are much, much lower as an ecological priority. As a problem, they are much less of a problem than looking at carpeting and drapes. And of course, my girlfriend was shocked. She never thought about carpeting or drapes before as a major source of pollution in landfills. Now, the only government I've seen address that, because again, you can look this up pretty much anywhere, different countries and sometimes specific cities, very often it's the city level of government will do waste stream analysis because they're having to plan the city dump for the future, the city, local, municipal government. As the city of Hong Kong, I remember they had an official government program for that, because when the city of Hong Kong did the analysis of their waste stream, they were shocked. They had tons and tons of garbage being generated out of carpeting. And why? Well, this is true of many cities around the world, but in Hong Kong especially, there were just so many apartments where every year people were tearing out the carpeting and replacing it. I can imagine a lot of reasons for that in Hong Kong, including just how expensive rent is, the climate, etc., etc. But the enormous bulk of carpeting every year was getting pulled out of the ground and sent to the dump and replaced. And again, this adds up to tons and tons. It adds up to both weight and volume. That's difficult to imagine in the waste stream. Now, why do I mention this? The point is, if you really care about ecology, all the time you're learning about these things where you just think, wow, I never thought of that. I never thought to come up with an estimate for just how much carpeting the city of Hong Kong puts into a dump every year. And then to compare that in relative scale and say, okay, is carpeting more of a problem or less of a problem than plastic bags? Is carpeting more of a problem or less of a problem than certain types of industrial waste? Is carpeting more of a problem or less of a problem than plastic furniture being thrown in the garbage or wooden furniture being thrown in the garbage? That stuff adds up also in the waste stream, right? Where are our priorities and how are we thinking about these things? So in that sense, anyone who's serious about ecology, they should be really prepared to hear, guess what? Here's a new priority. Here's a new factor you haven't thought about, the vegan issue, the knot of issues related to meat production. And you have to reevaluate. Again, it's not so much looking at it in isolation. How important is veganism compared to the difference between people driving gas cars and driving electric cars? It's very depressing for us to face up to, but the type of savings you get ecologically, because people are still driving cars, between an electric car and a gas car is not that radical. You can measure it in percentages. You can measure it in megatons of pollution. It is an improvement, don't get me wrong. The type of change you can achieve by having a coal power plant as opposed to a gas power plant. Right now the United States is making that transition in a huge way, partly because they have new cheap sources of gas from fracking. So they have new sources of shale oil within the United States, so more and more coal plants are shutting down, and they're having gasoline burning plants, to simplify slightly. And it is an ecological improvement. It is a difference, and you can measure it in percentages, and you can measure it in megatons of carbon being put in the atmosphere, and there are a number of other really interesting ecological factors that are unique to coal, different types of pollution that are especially a problem with coal that you're eliminating. There is some improvement, but you're getting down into percentages, you're getting down to these fine points of comparison. And what's interesting is when you look at the whole life cycle, production and consumption of meat, this is not a difference of a few percentage points. It's actually a shocking paradigm shift difference. If you have millions of people eating meat as opposed to millions of people refusing to eat meat, the change in the impact is just unbelievable. There's no way to compare. Again, whole life cycle. You don't just look at the slaughterhouse. You don't just look at the final product. Look at the whole process of the industry. The water consumed, the water pollution, the air pollution, the use of resources in producing pork as opposed to producing tofu, beef as opposed to producing chickpeas. This is something radically, exponentially different, as well as being fundamentally, ethically different, as well as being better for your health, etc., etc. But this is something that someone with an ecological background should be able to hear, should be able to analyze, should be able to appropriate or assimilate quick, and they can't. So Haruki goes to this festival, and the reality is he's talking to people who are his enemies, but who should be his allies. How do you bridge that gap? How do you, if ever, reach someone who shares with you a belief in this objective, apparently, but who regards veganism as so alien that they think you mentioning it is disrespectful to them, that he is being disrespectful to their conference on climate change, ecology, and natural resource use? That's really alien. I mean, in some ways, like what Haruki is describing here, the other people at this conference are more alien from Haruki than I'm alien from someone else who's vegan, but this other someone else who believes in, say, Christianity. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in Christianity at all. And it is when I talk to people who are real believing Christians, they're very alien from me. But if we have veganism in common, obviously there are a whole lot of beliefs, a whole lot of issues in terms of outlook on the world where there's something to build on. And Haruki is going to this conference and instead seeing this fissure. Where do we go from here? Well, look, one of the themes I talk about again and again on the internet is the issue of generosity of spirit. Do I have the generosity of spirit to sit down and try to cooperate with someone who's Christian? When I'm not just an atheist, I have a lot of reasons to dislike Christianity, to be biased against a Christian, to resent the whole history of Christianity and even what Christians are doing today, Christian missionaries, their impact on indigenous people. Within Canada, the terrible things Christianity has done. Within Southeast Asia, the terrible things Christianity has done. Unbelievable. So if I meet a Christian it actually does take some generosity of spirit on my part to bridge that gap, to sit down at the same table, to try to cooperate and work together. And at this conference, I mean, apparently Haruki came away from it with nobody who's going to cooperate with him, work with him, which is very sad. I think one of the saddest things about middle age is that many people lose their generosity of spirit. Some people never had it. Some people didn't have any generosity of spirit as teenagers, so don't get me wrong. It's not a universal or innate characteristic that people have. But when you meet people, are you going to judge them by their potential to do good in the future? Or are you going to judge them by who they are right now, who they already are, what they're already doing? The most generous thing you can do with people is to set aside the bad things they've done in the past, to set aside the harm they're doing now, and to look at them and relate to them in terms of their potential to do good in the future. And on a case-by-case basis, I think you need to meet people and look into their eyes, and you need to make that decision for yourself. There's no way you can make a blanket decision like, this is how I'm going to talk to Christians, or this is how I'm going to talk to white people who are into yoga and rock crystals and pseudoscience, but who are also vegan. Again, it's a huge gap there. Very difficult for me to cooperate with those people, very difficult for me to talk to those people. There's no way you can have a blanket decision. This is how I'm going to talk to people who are part of the scientific community or professional politicians engaged with these ecological issues, but who eat meat, who are non-vegan. Or this is how I'm going to relate to people who are hunters, but who really care about ecology and forest conservation. People who hunt and eat meat, but who care about some other things. There is no way you can have a decision that applies to all of them uniformly. I think on a case-by-case basis, you need to talk to people, you need to listen to people, look into their eyes if possible, and you have to decide, if you have it in you, whether or not you have the generosity of spirit to treat them not as they are, to treat them not as they deserve to be treated, not to judge them based on their past conduct or their current conduct, but to judge them based on their potential to do good in the future, to make the world a better place. Because the people at this conference, I think some of them have that potential, even if they're scumbags, even if they're engaged in every ridiculous excuse for organic meat, happy meat, for living a lifestyle that I find ethically unforgivable, for living a life of self-selected obscurity, of voluntary ignorance and excuse-making for evil and cruelty, self-indulgence, and harm of the worst kind. Am I going to put that aside, and am I going to try to do something positive with you? Yes or no. It's a face-to-face, human-to-human decision. And for that reason, I mean, one of the questions I get asked, obviously, is why are comments disabled on this channel? If you compare the amount of time you spend, if you spend 1 hour making comments on the internet, reading in a public forum, whether it's Reddit or on YouTube, and it may be 15 minutes here and there that adds up. You might think, oh, I never spend an hour doing comments on the internet. Use a stopwatch. Actually time yourself how much time you're spending talking to strangers through that kind of anonymous typewritten format, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. Many of you watching this video, you are wasting many hours a week. But it's very likely you're spending more than 1 hour a week with that kind of typing communication with strangers. I would challenge you to stop doing that. Take that 1 hour and instead deal with one person who has some potential, by telephone, by Skype, or by face-to-face. And as you do that again and again, many times it'll lead nowhere. You'll spend 1 hour talking to somebody, and you'll decide either they don't have it in them to make something positive happen, or that you don't have it in you to make something positive happen in cooperation. That's fine. But I promise you, taking that 1 hour to talk to one person on Skype, by telephone, in person, it's a much more meaningful way to seek out the basis for real activism than engaging in 100 hours of anonymous, faceless, witty banter in comment sections, because that can lead nowhere. And when you're doing it, I urge you to keep this concept of generosity of spirit in mind. Because you're not out here to prove that you're smarter than other people. And the internet traps people that way. People lose sight of that. They think they're out here to be the smartest or the prettiest or the most popular. And you're not. All of that is meaningless. The only test that matters is whether or not you have the generosity of spirit to cooperate with other people, and whether or not you can find the other people who really can cooperate with you. And I hate to say it, but there's a meaningful sense in which the lives of millions of animals hang on this. The quality of life for millions of human beings hangs on this. And yes, in some abstract sense, climate change, the future of planet Earth, hangs on this. So if you've got that 1 hour to spend, I'm asking you to spend it better.